The dimensional tier closed behind him like a wound stitching itself shut, and for a long moment, Mark Grayson hung suspended in the cold silence between worlds. His cape, torn and scorched, drifted around him like the last banner of a forgotten army. Beneath the yellow and blue of his uniform, his ribs ached from a battle that already felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The criminal he had been chasing, a metahuman warlord capable of cracking continents, was gone, swallowed somewhere into the folds of unstable space. And Mark, the boy who had once promised his mother he would always come home, fell through clouds he did not recognize toward a skyline that was not his own. He braked at the last possible second. The impact still cratered an empty parking lot, and dust rolled outward in a slow gray wave. For a heartbeat, he simply knelt there, breathing, listening, letting the world settle around him. The air smelled different here, touched with something faintly chemical, like a city that never quite stopped sweating. When he finally rose and walked out onto the street, he expected fear. He expected the usual reaction: screaming, phones lifted in trembling hands. Instead, no one even looked at him. People walked past as though a young man in a torn superhero costume was merely another part of the scenery. A jogger glanced his way and offered a polite, distracted nod. A child clutching a plastic figurine pointed at him, then immediately lost interest when a louder advertisement bloomed across a nearby screen. Mark blinked slowly and turned in a quiet circle, trying to understand. The city rose around him in glittering towers, but every surface seemed to be selling something. Billboards as tall as buildings glowed with the smiling faces of costumed heroes. One held a cereal box, another endorsed a luxury sedan. A third smiled down with impossibly white teeth framed by a slogan that promised safety, strength, and the American way. There were posters in bus shelters, banners on lampposts, a steady scrolling crawl on the side of a skyscraper announcing tour dates, comic releases, branded fragrances, and exclusive streaming events. Heroes here, it seemed, were not legends. They were brands. Mark walked slowly, taking it in, the unease in his chest growing quieter and more dangerous, the way a held breath grows heavier the longer it lasts. He passed a coffee shop where two baristas argued over which member of some celebrity hero team was the most attractive. He passed a school where children traded glossy trading cards featuring caped figures striking dramatic poses. There were no whispers of fear. There was no awe. There was only consumption, smooth and constant, like a river that had forgotten it was once a storm. He told himself this could still be a good world. Different, yes. Strange, certainly. But heroes still existed. People still cheered. Perhaps here, in this place, the work of protection had simply become more visible, more celebrated. Perhaps that was not a bad thing. Then the screams began. A blur of red and white tore down the avenue ahead, faster than the human eye could track, leaving a shock wave of displaced air that shattered windows along 3 blocks. A speedster grinning for the cameras was performing what the floating news drones cheerfully described as a daring rescue from a runaway armored truck. Mark moved instinctively, lifting from the pavement, ready to help. But by the time he reached the corner, it was already over. The truck had stopped. The speedster posed beside it, arms folded, chin lifted. And on the asphalt behind him lay 3 civilians, broken and still, their bodies caught in the careless wake of his velocity. Mark stared. He waited for the speedster to kneel, to check pulses, to grieve. Instead, the man laughed at something a producer said into his earpiece, then jogged toward the cameras, smoothing his hair. Within seconds, the news drones pivoted. Smiling anchors replaced the footage. The bodies on the ground were quietly draped, then quietly removed, while the chyron beneath the broadcast read, in clean white letters, another victory for the people's hero. No correction was issued. No name was spoken. The dead simply disappeared from the story. Mark stood very still on the rooftop, the wind tugging at his torn cape, his heart beating slowly and coldly. Something here was deeply, terribly wrong. For the next several days, Mark moved through the city like a ghost wearing a hero's face. He kept to rooftops and alleys, listening, watching, learning. The more he learned, the more the unease in his chest hardened into something colder, something closer to dread. Every channel, every screen, every conversation eventually circled back to the same name. The corporation that did not simply employ heroes. The corporation that manufactured them. He watched their commercials with quiet horror. Sleek, beautifully edited spots showed costumed figures saving children from burning buildings, lifting cars off trapped families, smiling humbly into the lens while uplifting music swelled. Then, on hidden police scanners he could hear from miles away, he listened to the truth. The burning buildings were scheduled. The trapped families were vetted, signed, and paid. The car accidents were arranged hours in advance, with stunt coordinators measuring sight lines for the best camera angle. Tragedy here was not endured. It was produced. What disturbed him most was not the deception. It was how seamlessly the city accepted it. People did not seem to mind that their saviors were actors. They wanted the performance. They wanted the merchandise. They wanted the comfort of believing someone strong was watching over them, even if that someone, in truth, was watching only the ratings. Mark could not bring himself to do nothing. So, quietly, almost shyly, he began to help. He pulled a delivery driver from a wreck on a freeway overpass before the paramedics had even been called. He caught a falling window washer 2 blocks from a Vought soundstage, set him gently on the pavement, and was gone before the man could ask his name. He stopped an armed robbery at a corner store by simply standing in the doorway, arms folded, until the trembling gunman dropped his weapon and walked out into the waiting night. He did not pose. He did not smile for any lens. He did not wait to be thanked, but people noticed. A grainy phone video appeared online of a young man in a blue and yellow costume gently carrying an elderly woman across a flooded intersection, setting her down on dry sidewalk, then nodding politely before vanishing into the rain. Another clip showed him kneeling beside a frightened child after a subway derailment, speaking softly, holding her hand until her mother arrived. There were no slogans. There were no sponsors. There was only the strange, unfamiliar sight of a superhuman who seemed to care. The videos spread quickly, the way wildfires spread through dry grass. Comment sections filled with confusion, with hope, with longing. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why did he look so tired? Why did his eyes look like they actually meant it? People who had grown numb to capes and slogans found themselves replaying these clips at 3 a.m, not entirely sure why their chests ached when they did. For the first time in years, this world remembered what a hero was supposed to feel like. And, of course, Vought noticed. In a glass tower high above the city, executives in tailored suits gathered around a long table and watched the footage on loop. They did not see a hero. They saw a problem. A product they did not own. One of them tapped a manicured nail against the screen and asked, very quietly, "Who is this boy?" Another, smiling without warmth, suggested that perhaps the answer did not matter. Perhaps what mattered was simply how quickly they could brand him, or, failing that, how quickly they could bury him. In another room, behind reinforced doors, a different figure watched the same footage in silence. His arms were folded. His blue eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. The cape draped over his shoulder was perfectly clean. Homelander did not speak for a long time. He simply tilted his head, studying the boy on the screen, the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided whether to befriend or to break. The invitation came wrapped in cameras. A black car arrived at the rooftop where Mark had been resting, doors opening as though they had always expected him. A polished woman with a clipboard introduced herself as a Vought liaison, smiling the practiced smile of someone whose teeth had been insured. They were thrilled, she said. Absolutely thrilled. The world wanted to meet him. Homelander himself wanted to meet him. Would he be willing to attend a brief, friendly press event? Just a handshake. Just a photograph. Just a moment between heroes. Mark agreed, but not because he was flattered. He agreed because he wanted to look this man in the eye. The press event was a cathedral of light. Spotlights crossed the stage in slow, sweeping arcs. Banners with the Vought logo unfurled like the standards of an empire. Thousands of fans screamed beyond the velvet ropes, waving signs, holding up phones, chanting names that had been chosen by focus groups. And in the center of it all, smiling beneath the flag, stood Homelander, arms open, the perfect picture of fatherly welcome. He embraced Mark warmly for the cameras. To the watching world, it looked like a passing of the torch, a meeting of generations, the legend and the rising star. But up close, with his ear near Mark's, Homelander's voice was a different thing entirely. Almost gentle, threaded with something cold beneath the warmth. He told Mark how impressed he was, how proud, how exciting it was to see new talent. And then, almost as an afterthought, he reminded Mark that this world had rules, that heroes here understood the importance of unity, of discipline, of staying on message. He smiled the whole time he said it. The camera saw only kindness. Mark smiled back because he had been raised to be polite. Then, when the microphones came forward and the reporters began asking questions, he answered honestly. He was asked what he thought of Vought. He said he was still learning, but that he was troubled by how often civilian deaths seemed to vanish from the news. He was asked what he thought of the hero industry. He said he was not sure heroism should be an industry at all. He was asked finally what he believed a hero was. And Mark, exhausted and sincere, said that a hero was someone who tried to make people braver, not more afraid. The hall went very quiet. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then the publicists laughed too loudly, the music swelled, and Homelander clapped Mark on the shoulder with a grip that bent the floorboards beneath their feet. "Charming," he said. "Refreshingly idealistic. We will have to talk more. Privately." Backstage, the smile was gone. Homelander stood in a corridor of polished marble, breathing slowly, fists clenched at his sides. He had spent his entire life learning how to be loved by people who could not see past his uniform. And now, here was a boy, barely an adult, who did not even seem to want their love. A boy who spoke of inspiration as though it were something one could give away for free. That was the part that frightened him, although he would never use that word. Because heroes like Homelander were powerful because the world feared them and adored them in equal measure. A hero who only wanted to be useful, who did not crave the worship, who did not need the lights, was a hero who could not be leashed. In the days that followed, Mark's words traveled faster than Vought could contain them. Clips of his quiet, almost reluctant honesty were stitched into compilations. Teachers played them in classrooms. Soldiers shared them in barracks. Mothers showed them to children at bedtime, whispering, "See, baby, this is what it is supposed to look like." And somewhere far above the city, in a private suite at the top of a tower made of glass and money, Homelander watched the same clips, his jaw tight, his eyes a little too bright, and decided that this boy could not be allowed to keep speaking. They came for him on a wet Tuesday night in an alley behind a closed laundromat where the streetlights buzzed like trapped insects. Mark heard them long before he saw them. 5 heartbeats. 4 men trying very hard not to breathe loudly, and one who did not seem to care whether he was heard at all. The one who did not care stepped out first, lit a cigarette with hands that had clearly been broken more than once, and said, in an accent thick as engine grease, "All right, sunshine, fancy a chat." Billy Butcher did not look like a man who trusted superheroes. He looked like a man who had buried someone because of one. Behind him, the others emerged from the dark. A nervous young man with kind eyes, a grim woman with a sniper's stillness, a quiet figure with the build of an old soldier, and a Frenchman who smiled the way some people smile right before they hurt you and right after. Mark could have ended the conversation in less than a second. He did not. He listened because something in Butcher's voice, beneath the swagger and the threat, sounded like grief. And grief, Mark had learned, was almost always honest. They took him to a basement that smelled of damp concrete and old coffee. They showed him things there. Recordings, footage that Vought had spent fortunes to bury. Mark watched in silence as the curtain peeled back, layer by layer, and the world he had been walking through revealed the rot beneath its polished skin. He saw experiments, children injected with an unstable blue compound, screaming in cribs that had been bolted to the floor. He saw cover-ups. A small town in the Midwest erased from maps after a hero's tantrum leveled 3 blocks and killed 41 people, including a school bus full of children whose names had been quietly replaced in the public record. He saw manufactured disasters where heroes themselves caused the very crises they would later be film-solving. He saw boardroom recordings where men and women in tailored suits debated the optimal civilian casualty count for maximum quarterly engagement. He saw a girl, no older than 19, who had once trusted Homelander and who now existed only as a stain on a hotel ceiling. Mark stood up at one point and walked to the far wall and put his forehead against the cold concrete and did not speak for a long time. The boys did not interrupt him. They had all stood at that wall in their own way on their own nights. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red and his voice was quiet, and he said, "Why has no one stopped this?" Butcher exhaled smoke and said, "Because the ones strong enough to stop it are the ones doing it." Mark thought about home then. He thought about his father and the long, terrible lesson he had learned about idols. He thought about his mother, who had told him that being good was harder than being strong and more important. He thought about the cities he had saved and the people who had hugged him afterward, and how none of them had ever needed him to sell them anything. Heroism in his world had been a complicated, painful, sometimes brutal thing, but it had never, until now, been a lie told for money. He could have left. He could have torn open another rift, gone home, told himself this was not his fight. No one would have blamed him. He was 19 years old, in a universe that was not his own, surrounded by strangers who had asked him to risk everything for a war he had not started. But Mark Grayson had inherited something heavier than power. He had inherited the weight of choosing what to do with it. He turned to Butcher and to the small, frightened, furious people gathered behind him, and he said, very simply, "Tell me everything. Tell me where they sleep. Tell me where they hide their secrets. Tell me where the cameras are not. I am not going to kill anyone, but I am going to make it impossible for them to keep lying." Butcher studied him for a long moment, the cigarette burning low between his fingers. Then he laughed, a short, surprised, almost grateful laugh, and clapped Mark on the shoulder with the kind of force that would have broken any ordinary man's collarbone. "Welcome to the resistance, sunshine," he said. "Try not to die before breakfast." And somewhere above them, in a tower of glass and money, a red-caped figure stood at a window, sensing, without knowing why, that the boy he had decided to break had just become something far harder to kill. The campaign against Mark began quietly, the way all good lies begin. A leaked photograph that was not quite real, an anonymous source claiming he had hurt someone, a retired hero with sad eyes appearing on a morning show, sighing about the dangers of unregulated power. Within days, the same news drones that had once celebrated his rescues were rebranding him as unstable, possibly dangerous, a young man with too much strength and too few answers. Then came the staged attacks. A bridge wired to fail at the precise moment Mark flew over it so that cameras would catch him standing among the wreckage. A bank robbery orchestrated by Vought operatives designed to make him look slow or hesitant or cruel. A hostage situation in which the hostages had been told in advance to scream his name as though he were the threat. And each time, Mark simply did what he had always done. He saved the people. He left without comment. He let the footage speak. The footage, increasingly, did not say what Vought wanted it to say. Because no matter how the producers edited it, no matter how the Chirons twisted it, the camera kept catching the same things. A boy kneeling beside an old man untying his hands with shaking fingers. A boy whispering to a crying child while pulling rebar out of a collapsed wall. A boy who never once turned to face the lens, even when the lens followed him for blocks. The public, slowly, began to feel the contradiction in their bones. They had been told to fear him. But the boy on their screens did not look like something to fear. He looked like something they had been missing for a very long time. Then came the day the illusion broke. A protest had gathered downtown. Tens of thousands of ordinary people, tired of cover-ups, tired of branded saviors, marching beneath homemade signs. Vought sent its heroes to manage the optics. The plan was simple. A small staged incident. A few broken windows. Just enough chaos to justify the cameras turning on the protesters instead of the corporation. It did not stay small. A speedster shoved too hard. A flying brute laughed too loudly. A man in the crowd fell beneath a boot and did not get back up. The cameras, for once, did not look away fast enough. The blood on the pavement was not the kind that could be cropped out of a thumbnail. Mark arrived in the sky above the square like a sudden silence. He did not shout. He did not pose. He descended slowly between the panicking crowd and the advancing line of Vought heroes, and he held up one hand, and he said, "That is enough." For a heartbeat, the whole square seemed to hold its breath. Then Homelander descended through the clouds, smiling that perfect, terrible smile, and the heartbeat ended. What followed was not a battle. It was a tearing. Homelander struck first with the full, unfiltered force he had spent decades pretending he did not have, and the shockwave of that single blow shattered every window for 6 blocks and lifted Mark clean through the side of a skyscraper. Concrete and glass rained down on the screaming crowd. The cameras miraculously kept rolling. Mark caught a falling steel beam before it could crush a family. He set it gently aside. Then he flew back into the sky, blood on his lip, and met Homelander midair with a sound like 2 tectonic plates remembering they were once one continent. They fought above the city for what felt like hours, although it was only minutes. Homelander fought to be seen. He postured. He laughed for the lenses. He aimed his blows toward landmarks, toward statues, toward billboards, choosing his angles for maximum spectacle. Mark fought to protect. Again and again he broke off mid-strike to catch a falling pedestrian, to redirect a collapsing wall, to absorb an explosion meant for a crowd. He bled for it. He was slower because of it. He took blows he could have dodged, because dodging would have meant letting someone behind him die. The camera saw all of it. They saw Homelander snarling at a child who would not stop crying loudly enough to ruin his shot. They saw Mark, half blinded by his own blood, gently covering that same child with his cape. They saw Homelander laugh as a bus tipped. They saw Mark catch it on his back. By the time the dust settled, the skyline was unrecognizable, and so was the story. There were no chirons quick enough to spin what the world had just watched. There were no slogans large enough to cover it. Every screen in every home in every country had seen in unedited, unscripted, undeniable clarity what a hero looked like and what a hero did not. Mark stood among the rubble, shaking, exhausted, holding the unconscious child against his chest, and the world, for the first time in a long time, did not know what to say. In the days after the battle, the silence felt heavier than the noise had been. The city was still standing, but only barely. Cranes moved slowly through the wreckage. Funerals filled the parks because the churches were not large enough. And on every screen in every home, the same images played again and again, not because anyone was promoting them, but because no one could look away. Vought tried at first to do what Vought had always done. Press releases. Apologies that explained nothing. Carefully chosen heroes paraded before cameras to express their sorrow, their unity, their commitment to doing better. But the words landed differently now. They sounded thinner. They sounded like the slogans they had always been. The public, which had spent decades nodding along, no longer nodded. Stock prices fell. Sponsors quietly disappeared from billboards overnight. Children stopped wearing certain capes to school. Old footage resurfaced, unprompted, on every platform, and people watched it with new eyes, seeing now what they had always been told not to see. The illusion had not simply cracked. It had been documented in high definition from 40 angles. Inside Vought Tower, the boardroom shouted. Inside Homelander's private suite, the silence was worse. He stood at his window for long hours, staring down at a city that had once chanted his name and now whispered another. He was not used to being the second story on the news. He was not used to being the villain in any narrative. The mirror had turned, and for the first time in his long, gleaming life, he did not recognize the man inside it. Among the heroes themselves, lines began to form. Some, frightened, drew closer to Homelander, calculating that loyalty was safer than conscience. Others quietly began to drift. A few showed up at hospitals without cameras. One returned a sponsorship check. Another simply walked out of a press event mid-sentence and did not come back. None of them said Mark's name out loud. They did not need to. Mark himself was not in the city anymore. He had gone somewhere quiet, somewhere with trees, where the only sounds were wind and water and the occasional cry of a distant bird. He sat for a long time on a rock by a slow river, his cape folded beside him, his hands resting open on his knees, and he tried to understand what he was feeling. He had won. That was the strange part. He had stood against the most powerful man in this world, and the world had seen him, and the world had chosen, in its quiet, fragile way, to believe him. And yet he did not feel triumphant. He felt tired. He felt the weight of every face he had not been fast enough to save. He felt the way certain children had looked at him afterward, with awe in their eyes, and he knew that awe was a heavy thing to carry and a dangerous thing to be given. He thought about leaving. He thought about tearing open another rift, going home, letting this world figure itself out. The thought did not last, because he understood now what his mother had been trying to tell him years ago in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and morning light. Power did not fix the world. Power only revealed what kind of person you had decided to be. He stayed by the river until the sun began to set. Then he stood slowly and brushed the dust from his uniform and looked up at the darkening sky, and he made a small, quiet promise to no one in particular. He would not become the hammer this world expected him to become. He would not let the corruption that had grown here grow inside him. He would keep helping in the small, unglamorous, deeply human ways that his parents had taught him mattered most. He would keep believing that people deserved real heroes. Even here, especially here. And somewhere far above, the first faint star of the evening flickered into view, as if it had been listening. The months that followed did not arrive with fanfare. They arrived in small, ordinary moments scattered across the world like seeds. A flood in a coastal town and a young man in a blue and yellow uniform working through the night, lifting cars, carrying the elderly, returning to the water again and again until every house had been checked. He left before the news crews arrived. The townspeople remembered him anyway. A war zone on the other side of the world, where bombs had been falling for years and no celebrity hero had ever come. He came. He did not pick a side. He simply stood between the children and the falling sky again and again until the falling stopped. He gave no interviews. He posed for no flags. A wildfire in a forest no one had heard of, swallowing a village no map cared about. He arrived in the smoke, dug fire breaks with his bare hands, and was gone by morning. Someone left a glass of milk on a windowsill for him, the way one might for a wandering saint. Governments did not know what to do with him. They issued statements. They demanded oversight. They built committees and passed resolutions and drafted laws that he politely, quietly refused to obey. He broke no innocent person's door. He took no nation's side. He simply went where the suffering was. And he helped, and he left, and he could not be bought, and he could not be bribed, and he could not be bribed, and he could not, no matter how many cameras tried. Corporations feared him most of all. He was the variable they could not brand, the product they could not own, the story they could not write the ending to. In Vaught's shrinking towers, executives spoke of him in lowered voices, as though saying his name too loudly might make him appear in their lobby. Homelander, for his part, did not speak of him at all. He simply stood sometimes at his window watching the horizon and clenching his perfect jaw. Ordinary people, though, did something stranger. They began to trust again. Not slogans, not commercials, not flags or franchises or curated smiles. They trusted the rumor that somewhere out there, a young man with tired eyes was still flying through skies he had not been born under, helping strangers he would never be paid to save. Children drew him in their notebooks without capes, without logos, just a boy in the air with his hand reaching down. Old men told stories about him over cheap coffee. Mothers whispered his quiet, unbranded name at bedtime, the way mothers in older times had whispered the names of saints. And slowly, almost too slowly to notice, the idea of heroism in that broken world began to change. Not because of marketing, not because of fear, but because, in a universe designed to corrupt every good thing it touched, one young hero had refused, gently and stubbornly and entirely, to become like the rest,